24, 1971. Now, Mr. Ball, you said that you really would like to talk about agriculture in this part of it?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. You want to hold it?
My family, all the way back, were farmers that I know of. My grandfather left Illinois when my father was 2 weeks old in a covered wagon and came to Kansas. And he farmed in Kansas. And then my folks came to El Reno, Oklahoma in 1897 on the Rock Island. They got a room at Mr. Hall's rooming house here in El Reno. And my dad got a job at a feed store the next morning with a Mr. Bender that did business here in El Reno. And Mr. Bender thought my father was a good worker and that he wanted to farm, so he made arrangements with his brother-in-law, who was a widower, Mr. Charlie Howard, for my folks to go out there and sharecrop with them. And during the first year they were there, Mr. Howard married a sister of Mr. Carl Borneman that just come over from Germany. And so my folks had to hunt for another place. Well, the young fellows nowadays can't hardly believe this. My dad started farming on his own. He borrowed some money, and Mother had been a school teacher for 6 years, and she had a little money saved up. And they bought 4 mules and a plow, and that was just about the size, and a wagon, of course, and that was about the size of their equipment. After that first year, the farm they rented after they left Howard sold, and they had to move again. So Dad had 4 mules that he had bought, and he sold those mules to the army during the Spanish-American War and bought 5 mares and had a little money left over. And those 5 mares, through the years, on average 3 or 4 mule colts a year. So he was raising his replacement for power. Those days, our horse furnished the horsepower that we had, also the transportation, and also the pleasure. People would ride wagons or ride horseback around on their Sundays or their time off and see the country and visit the neighbors. And some of the young bucks would have a few horse races and have contests with their horses. And my father was on this place that they moved to 2 years, and that place sold. So he moved over in the West Point neighborhood, where we have been ever since. Dad kept raising mule colts from these mares that he had, and when he bought the home place, he sold a bunch of mules that he had on hand and made the down payment. And it was much easier for a young fellow to get started those days.
When was the official be?
1899, and we moved over in the West Point neighborhood in 1904. And the 3 generations of the family have rented this same land since. Dad bought the home place. He bought from the Hutchison family that joined this section of renting land. And we have quite a lot of pleasure in talking to the family about the 3 generations working together. Now, my folks in their days, farming along in the early 1900s, there was a general practice with these general stores. If a fellow's credit was good, the 1st of August, that was the starting of the new farm year. They'd go into the storekeeper and make arrangements for the year's credit. And that sounds kind of wild with the price of things nowadays, but their year's bill didn't run very high. But the whole family looked forward to when Dad went in and paid the year's bill, because the storekeeper would give Mother a set of dishes, or a new hat, or a new coat, and the kids always looked forward to a big sack of candy Dad brought home.
Down in Louisiana, we call that lanyard.
Well, we just called that just good old fellowship up here in Oklahoma. And they didn't sign any papers or anything. They just dealt on a handshake. And of course, if a fellow hadn't took care of his business properly, he didn't have a chance to get in on those kind of credits. And from the time I was a child, there's only one thing I wanted to do, was farm and deal in livestock. My playtime was under the old apricot trees, where I took an old hoe that the handle was broke out, used it for a plow, and plowed up the different fields, made the fence with twine string and stakes, corn cobs with our hogs and cattle, and that's the way we played. We didn't have a backyard with $500 or $600 of equipment like some of the grandchildren have nowadays. And then I graduated from high school in 1919. That was at Yukon, Oklahoma. And I wanted to farm. And I had a chance to rent 320 acres of ground. I went into the old banker 2 weeks before school was out and told him what I had and what chance I had to get land to farm. He wanted to know what I had. I had $10 in my pocket and a pony and her coat. But I had a chance to trade the pony and her coat for a pair of small mules that wasn't broke, which I found out was quite a job by the time I got those little rascals broke. And he said, "How much money would you need?" Well, I figured it'd be $2,000. I'd need $1,000 right away to buy teams with to break the soil for the wheat crop, and then another $1,000 later for equipment. And these young fellows nowadays can't hardly believe this, that he just fixed a note and I signed it, and nobody signed or anything else. He knew my family, he knew they'd work, and he hoped I would, I'm sure. And then along in 23 and along there, when times got tough, I sometimes wondered if he didn't wonder why he made a loan like that. I tell people that when I get a notice about a note being due, when times got tough, that when he reached in the note cabinet and pulled out that note and held it up, it looked like it was burning his fingers. I'd tell him sometimes I can pay the interest, but I guess we'll just have to renew it. Sometimes I'd have to tell him, well, I guess we'll have to add the interest in and make a new note. But we finally got it paid off. I was married in 1925, and I was lucky enough to marry a girl that was willing to go on with farming, and she could get more out of the garden, more canned, and raise more chickens than anybody in the country almost. So we raised a family of 5, and one of those 5 is a farmer. And oh boy, the difference in the way he farms and the way they did when my father started out. Had a visitor out at the farm a while back, and he's looking around at all that machinery, and he said, "My Lord, got over $100,000 invested in machinery alone around here." And he's milking around 120 head of cows now. It would shock you to see his milk check. It'd also shock you to see his expenses. But they have family, 6 children out there, and some of those children I'm pretty sure is going to carry on the ball part in agriculture. Have a little granddaughter that she might not be too interested in the house, but you ought to see her getting her calves ready for the fair and helping her dad feed calves and take care of things outside. Another granddaughter is the best little housekeeper you ever saw. So we have a big time with our grandchildren. And I'm sure there'll be some of the Ball family go down through history fighting the soil and loving it is right. And there's one thing I can brag about beside my family, and that is I left all the land I farmed better shape than when I started with it. We worked with the soil conservation, and they did wonders for this country. We had the land we were operating, we had 7 ponds. Had fish in them, and that didn't make us unpopular with the country or our city friends. And we had a lot of terraces. And when you stop to think about it, those terraces might be a little bit of a nuisance, have to turn sometimes, but you're driving your tractor on the level, and that don't take fuel like going up and down hills. And we're real proud of Oklahoma in agriculture. Our county, which we feel like we have a part in, for 3 straight years now has been the #1 agricultural county in the state. And we've got to be quite a livestock county. I can't say offhand just how many head of cattle we have, but there's many places that has 300 or 400 head of good cattle, and they're really well-bred, sturdy type of cattle that really go ahead and do good in the feedlots. And we're here in Canadian County. We're just 30 minutes from Packingtown at Oklahoma City, and that means a whole lot on expenses of getting livestock to market. And they have the feeder stalker auction in Oklahoma City every Thursday. And if you read the Daily Oklahoman, it lists in there from which counties livestock come from. And it's very interesting to see how many head come from Canadian County.
Going back to your father's farming and your farming, what were your main problems? What were your fears? What were the things that really had the most apprehension?
We was always wondering about the weather. In Oklahoma, you can get the showers. I want to repeat what an old drifter that worked for me 2 or 3 different times said. He'd been all over the country, and he'd always say, "Frank, there isn't anything wrong with Oklahoma. A good shower won't cure." And I've always thought about that, and that pretty well sized it up. And a fellow that works his ground and prepares it, my son now has a system of the stubble mulch. After harvest, he follows the combine with a disc and chops the stubble up and the straw up, and then he follows up with a chisel that tears the ground loose all the way from 12 to 18 inches deep. And
you just plowed.
We just plowed, and when you were plowing with 4 or 5 horses, and the flies were real bad and it was real hot, it was awful easy to pull the lever back a notch and not go as deep as you should. And in those days, like when my father and I plowed with 4 horses on a 12-inch gang plow, we could generally hire somebody that would work for $1 a day and his room and board. Now you take, we won't, but they'd go out and they'd plow from 5 to 6 acres a day. But now, those big tractors my son has, he sends a man out and he can plow as high as 45 and 50 acres a day. But his help cost him $12 to $15, maybe $18 for that time.
The same years, though, that you did with what you had. Of course, we understand the progress and how magnificent progress is, particularly in the agricultural line. But you and your father did with what you had.
Oh, yes. My father, I skipped this when it's telling about him getting started. He didn't have a binder, but all the neighbors knew that he'd work. And that was the day when you were real neighborly. He'd make a deal with some of his neighbors. If they'd cut his wheat, he would shock theirs and help them with their thrashing. And the way he'd work, well, they were all glad to make the trade. And those are some of the changes. And
how big was the average farm then?
Average farm then was 160 acres. There was a house on about every quarter. And nowadays, you can drive 3 or 4 miles and not pass a house. Like my son farming over 1,000 acres. And does it easier than we did with 160. And then we all milked a few cows, like 6, 7. When we were farming, my wife and I, why, it got up to around 20. And at first we sold cream. And like when my father and mother first started out, they had 1 or 2 cows, and mother would make butter. And I always laughed about the old merchants. They were awful careful not to raise the voice so the other customers wouldn't hear. Oh, I'm glad to see you bring that in. I always use that for myself. And and it kind of shocked us sometimes how many ladies thought that they were eating their butter special.
Your father's farming was even more primitive than yours then, wasn't it?
Oh, yes. The time when I got started farming, there was a lot of difference then and when he started. Yeah. And our teams had an easier time because the machinery was being changed and made better at that time. And there's been an awful change in the machinery. We need some of that machinery my father used for our museum up here at El Reno. And we are hoping to get a shed built for the early day machinery.
Do you have some of it?
We have 3 pieces out here in the yard, an old grain wagon, an old 1-row corn planter, and a double shovel cultivator. In the early days, there was a lot of corn raised in this county. Nowadays, I doubt if there's 100 acres of corn raised to be harvested as corn.
Why was that? Because of the water situation?
Yeah, the drought in Oklahoma would generally come in the early July and catch it just about when they needed. This spring, my son was counting on planting corn to put in the silo for silage for those milk dairy cows. But it was so dry this spring he didn't get to plant it. And now he's planting sudex and kind of maize that grows real fast that we never heard of those days, and to put in the silo for feed.
Corn and hay then were the things that you raised for feed for cattle.
Corn, oats, and hay. Yeah. And when I started even, we stacked our hay loose in stacks. And we have a hay knife back here in the museum that the youngsters want to know what that was for. And instead of uncovering the whole stack when you went to feed, you just uncovered enough to make a wagon load, a hay rack load, and then next day you'd cut off another slab, and it worked out real well. And nowadays, my son, on feeding silage, it makes me envious. When I was operating another helper, and I would take a truck or a team and wagon, and we'd work most of the day feeding cattle. Now he goes out and touches a button, in 15 minutes can feed 125 head. But the labor situation forces him to do such as that.
Well, it was not only the fact that more people knew and worked the land, but there was also that friendliness that you spoke of a few minutes ago, wasn't there?
Oh, yes. Even when I was farming, that neighborliness was what got us by. Long in the 30s, when our family was small, money just wasn't, we neighbors would change help, thrashing, putting up silage. Well, everything that we did, we'd help each other. And now you don't see very much of that. And we raised a lot of corn in the early days here because it come handy. A lot of the people that made the run just had 2 horses.
Which run was this?
1889. And they could take that one team and a walking plow and break some ground on their place. And then they could work it up with those 2 horses. And then they could take a walking lister and lay off the rows, take that 1 horse planter and follow down the furrow and get it planted. Take 2 horses on an old walking cultivator, which I have ran, and I can't say I enjoyed it too much. And then, when they laid their corn by, just 2 horses on the wagon to shuck corn, and that was their equipment. The small grain, they needed at least 4 head to work the ground, and for the binder, and some of them just didn't have that. And in our country down there, a lot of corn is raised. And down in the Mustang country, down south of us, I've seen Mustang town almost covered up with corn, piled not only the cribs full, but all over the vacant lots down there. And then in those days, they fed a lot different. They would just feed their steers that they were feeding out ear corn. There was a feed grinding mill in the neighborhood 3 miles west of us, Mr. Hoffer. A horse would go around the grinder, and we'd run in with a bucket of feed and pour it in, and then when they come around, we'd step back and then go in and get the ground feed and carry it out, and that was quite a job. But nowadays, my son has a grinder mixer that he hooks on behind his big tractor, and he grinds his own dairy feed right there and mixes it according to whatever mixture that he decides on. And another thing I want to tell about the changes, in the early day, my father just did hardly keep any records at all, and I wasn't. Well, I might as well confess, my wife kept our records. And now my son, Dairy Herd Improvement Association, he sends it off for these machines, what you call it, computers. And then every evening, he has about an hour's work putting down what all his help did that day, what machinery he used, how much fuel they used, and he sends it to be computerized. And So that makes it pretty easy for his income tax, but sometimes he's kind of shocked how much he has to pay.
Mr. Powell, it's been perfectly wonderful talking with you, and we thank you so very much. The tape's just about run out, and I'm sure that we will enjoy this, and many, many people will enjoy it. It's been fun visiting with you today.
I have 2 great-grandchildren and 19 grandchildren, so I hope to have many more. And I hope maybe they can hear this someday.
I hope they can, too. I really do. Thank you again.